Excellent. Thank you all so much for inviting us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Is it this morning? Yes, this morning. The Homeless Protection Act is something that was brought to us by our consumers of a legislation that they wanted to pursue. And it's a campaign that we started about 2 years ago. So in terms of the information that we're going to provide today, I'm going to give a sort of a quick overview about what the Homeless Protection Act is and what we're trying to achieve. We'd also like to give you all a glimpse into the campaign and some of the work that we've been doing. This is just to kind of get you, to sort of understand what is the strategy that we've been using to try to educate people on this legislation and how to get it passed. We also want to talk about our plan for the upcoming session because we have a new session starting in a couple of months. And so what that's going to look like. And then most importantly, we want to hear from our advocates who are doing, a significant amount of work with this legislation. And so we'll hear a bit from them about why this is important to them, or perhaps also hear some personal stories. And then importantly, we want to share some calls to action for everybody that's on the call. And we think that's the easiest way to kind of get you involved if this is of interest. And so we'll have some opportunities for you moving forward. So there's going to be the opportunity to sign up as a supporter. There's going to be an opportunity to sort of see our latest report on the HPA. And then in general, just kind of learn about what we're doing. So I think as every person comes on, they'll have the opportunity to introduce themselves. I'm Natalie Anturiano. I'm the Director of Policy at Care for the Homeless. We're one of the co-leads for the campaign. And so I will move this slide forward so we can start to talk about the campaign a bit. Now, the legislation, as Harmony mentioned, the Homeless Protection, it would classify homelessness as a protected status under New York State hate crimes law. So specifically, it would add homelessness as a protected class. It means that an attack against a person experiencing homelessness motivated by bias could be treated as a hate crime. And I think that's the important thing there is that the person doesn't necessarily have to be experiencing homelessness. They have to be perceived to be experiencing homelessness. So it's that bias motivation that's important. And these are the bills there. These are going to change when we have the new session come up. For now, these are the bills that we have that we're able to share. Now, in terms of how prevalent this is, so the data, there's not a whole lot of official data that we have access to. There's a lot of reasons for that. Nationally, there is a report that's available from the National Coalition for the Homeless, and that has documented violent attacks against people experiencing homelessness nationwide since 1999. So the data from that goes from 1999 to 2022. That's about the most up-to-date data that we have. So we're missing the last year and a half. So in those 23 and it's by state. And so that's the only official sort of report that we have access to that we can point to. So in the 23 years, there have been 75 documented attacks that could be categorized as a hate crime in New York. These are, it's really intense to kind of share what some of these are, but it's really a lot of different things. It's people getting attacked on the subways. Someone was set on fire while sleeping on a stairway in a housing development. There's a lot of different examples of what this looks like, but they were specifically targeted because of their housing status. Now, we also know this is the official count. It's something that we can point to show as an example, but we also know that this is a very severe undercount. From conversations with our consumers, from conversations with people in general, in terms of how often they see this happen, we know that this is a severe undercount, and there's probably a lot of reasons for that. It's not necessary. It's not a protected category, so it's not necessarily when there's reporting about a specific attack. This is not recorded as a possible hate crime because that protection does not exist at the moment. Also, there is some hesitancy to speak to law enforcement sometimes to be able to tell them about this happening. And so we know just from conversations with folks that this is a severe undercount. Now, there's several reasons why we think that this legislation is important. We know that the long-term solution to violence is to shift public discourse from the dignity, worth, and humanity of our neighbors experiencing homelessness, while also increasing access and resources for a very robust social safety net. While we advocate for housing solutions and access to wraparound support services, which is a lot of the work that we do, we also have to work to destigmatize poverty and homelessness. And so we think that this is one of the mechanisms for that. So the first thing in terms of why we think this is necessary and needed is it would provide greater legal protection for people who are victimized due to attacks motivated by bias, again, because of their housing status or perceived housing status. The second thing that is really important in this, as I just mentioned, there is not a lot of data available for this. We think that it would create a much stronger mechanism for reporting and documenting attacks against people experiencing homelessness. So then we would have access to New York State has an official report every year, shows us the different categories of people or the different protected classes that have experienced any type of hate crime or violence directed at them. And so we would have access to those numbers to be able to show how prevalent this actually is. And with that information, I think the way that we've really seen this is probably the most impactful part is being able to counter the narrative that people experiencing homelessness are dangerous, when in reality, they're much more likely to be a victim rather than the perpetrator of a crime. And that data would essentially help us counter that narrative. So in a lot of ways, the stronger legal protection is important, especially for anybody that is victimized. But in terms of shifting public support, that this would be a really significant, this would have significant impact on that. Now, in terms of, we published a report earlier this year that kind of gave a bit more information about the impact that we think that this legislation would have. And I apologize, there's a construction going on upstairs, so I'm sorry if there's some background noise. I'm hoping you all can hear that. But there's a report that we published earlier this year that's sort of looking at what other states have this type of protection and what the impact has been. I'll have my colleague put that report into the chat if you're interested in sort of taking a look at that. But there are other states that have some type of protection like what we're looking to pass in New York. So we have Maryland, Rhode Island, Florida, DC, Utah, Alaska, and Maine. Some of you might be surprised some of these states have these types of protections. We were. So if we were to pass this type of protection, we would join these states in having something similar to what they have. In Maryland, DC, Florida, and Rhode Island, homelessness is included as a protected class, much like what we are trying to do here. So it's an attack motivated by bias can be treated as a hate crime. Maine, Alaska, and Utah have sort of a different legal mechanism. Homelessness is not a protected class for hate crimes, but these states allow sentencing enhancement for crimes committed against people experiencing homelessness through what's called the vulnerable victim status mechanism. So it's not the same of what's happening in New York, but it's along the same lines in terms of adding that extra protection. Importantly, sort of what we were able to find in the research, it's that the states that have included homelessness as a protected class, excluding Rhode Island, is the only one of the ones that included as a protected class, published accessible data that shows us how many incidents occur each year. So they're able to access that data that we're trying to get here in New York as well. For example, to show you in DC, since the law has been implemented, so for about 11 years now, and they're the locality in the state that has this protection for the longest amount of time at this point. So it's about since it passed in 2011, so they've had it for about 13 years, something like that. So in that time, it passed in 2011. We have data up until 2022. There were 8 cases that could be tried as hate crimes. And so we do know that the data is coming out of this specific protection. So that's something that was really important to us when we were doing the research. Now, our champions or our sponsors, both in the Assembly and the Senate, and these are just important for you all to know because these are, who we are in constant contact with in terms of trying to get these passed. But in the Assembly, it's Assemblymember Linda B. Rosenthal. And in the Senate, it's New York State Senator Luis R. Sepulveda. Oh, let me go back really quick. Okay. Now, in terms of, hate crimes in general, as we saw, with some of the data that came out of DC, we know that even though convictions are really low for homelessness motivated hate crimes, we still hold that it's a really valuable tool for deterrence, which is one of the important things. Destigmatization, which is what we're trying to achieve, and then ensuring that in the rare cases that do meet that high burden of proof, for bias motivation, that they're handled with the gravity that they deserve. This legislation would essentially allow for that to happen. Now, I want to turn it over to my colleague who's going to give a little bit of information about what we've been able to achieve through the campaign, and then a little bit about a possible enhancement to our current campaign that we have at the moment. So I'd love to invite Nicole on screen.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Nicole McVinue. I am the Director of Policy at Urban Pathways. Urban Pathways is the other co-lead on the Pass the HPA campaign alongside Care for the Homeless. So I'm going to share a little bit about what we've accomplished in this past year of advocacy. I think we've done quite a bit of building of this campaign. So, you know, when we first started talking about this, when advocates brought it to our attention, we did not have a sponsor on the Senate side. Assemblymember Rosenthal has introduced the bill multiple times, but we didn't have a sponsor on the Senate side. So we secured Senator Sepulveda to be our Senate sponsor. Natalie, could you go back a slide? There we go. Perfect, thank you. And then we have really, you know, during the last legislative session, we really worked on gathering supporters for the campaign. So we've been both gathering individual supporters as well as organizational supports. I think we have about 25 organizations signed on. And if your organization is not signed on, that's something we're going to be asking you to do a little bit later on. We also got some updates made to the bill. We initially, you know, the legislation talked about adding hate crime, homelessness as a protected class against hate crimes. But what we realized in our research of how this is implemented in other states is that we also needed to include a piece about the data, because we want to make sure that we are actually capturing how many you know, hate crimes are prosecuted. And so the state has an annual hate crimes report. And so we were able to update the language of the legislation to ensure that the protection for people experiencing homelessness was also included in that annual report. So that was a really important update that we made to the bill last fall before we entered the legislative session. And then in January of this year, we released our policy report, which has been added to the chat if you'd like to take a look at that. And this sort of reviews a lot of the data that Natalie was just speaking about. And then we have done, we did a lot of advocacy. So during the legislative session, we had an in-person lobby day with a small group of advocates from Urban Pathways who met with members of the Codes Committee. And the Codes Committee is where this bill sits. So that was really important to us to try to gather support from the Codes Committee members. And then we also had a virtual week of action in April towards the end of the legislative session to continue gathering that support. So continuing to target our Codes Committee members as well as other committees that we thought would be interested in this legislation, such as social services, the housing committees. And then we also did some work to gather press. So we got an article placed in Gothamist with a feature on WNYC, connecting this piece of legislation with the death of Jordan Neely on the subway. around the 1 year anniversary of that terrible incident. And we had multiple advocates featured in that article, which was a really excellent piece. And then we also had M.A. Dennis and Will Woods get an op-ed placed in City Limits, talking about the importance of this legislation and why it's important to them, which was also very powerful. In addition, we collected memos of support from our organizational supporters, and we, utilize these to really elevate the legislation and show to particularly the central staff in the Assembly and the Senate that there's a lot of support. We're not the only ones talking about this, that a lot of organizations support that. So that was fantastic. And then we also sort of started the conversation with the Codes Committee central staff in the Assembly. We were not able to get the legislation put on the agenda for the Codes Committee to get it passed out of committee, but we did start that conversation with the central staff in the Assembly. This past legislative session was very tricky because we had a really late budget last year, so there was not as much attention paid to legislation until sort of the end of the session, and so that definitely created some challenges for a lot of different campaigns. But we were successful in getting quite a few additional sign-ons. So we have 13 Assembly members signed on and 7 senators signed on as co-sponsors to this legislation. And so you can see the list here of who are currently co-sponsoring. And at the start of session, we only had 1 co-sponsor in the Assembly and none in the Senate. So we made really significant progress this year. And I'm going to speak, briefly as well about a possible enhancement to the legislation. We are currently looking at sort of criminal law through adding homelessness as a protected class against hate crimes. But we're looking at the possibility of expanding the legislation to also include a protection under human rights law. And so this would add housing status as a protected class to prohibit discrimination in employment, housing, credit, places of public accommodation, internships, domestic services, educational institutions. So this would significantly expand the protection under civil law, not just criminal law, by adding it to the human rights law. So that's something we're currently exploring. And as we think about getting this piece of legislation introduced, because it will need to be reintroduced this January, because the legislature runs on a 2-year cycle, we're looking at how we might be able to expand it to create even more protections under the legislation. So we will, for folks who sign on, this is something we will keep you updated on. And now I'm going to pass it over to M.A. Dennis to talk a little bit about what we are planning for in our upcoming advocacy.
Thank you, Nicole. Planning is very important. As they say with the 5 Ps, proper planning prevents poor performance. So we are planning some things to try to ensure that the HBA will do its best, it will perform its best. So we are going to continue to push for co-sponsors. If you have any relationships with elected officials, please reach out and ask for their co-sponsorship of the HPA. We're also going to schedule meetings with the codes committee members, especially the chairs, Assembly Member Dinowitz and Senator Bailey, and again, to continue to grow support. We are also going to work on adding homelessness as a protected category under human rights law. This has not been a short process, so we are continually taking feedback and just listening on ways to just sculpt and craft, language, definitions, whatever is necessary to get this to across the finish line. We also want to continue growing organizational and, very important, individual supporters. We don't want to lose sight of the grassroots, right? We also are going to work on, at some point, hosting a lobby day in Albany. And last but not least, we want to continue to bring attention to the issue via media commentaries. I believe that's the end of my presentation, but I would like to say one thing. This is a little bit off script. Media commentary. So myself and my comrade, Will Woods, we did a op-ed, which spoke about a year after Jordan Neely. And the reason why, to me, this is important, this HBA, is the P. Something about the P's is just the protection part. Because this person, Jordan Neely, was being choked to death, and there was no protection. So I ask you, put yourself in that scenario if you were on that train and you saw someone being choked, you saw the life leaving their body. At what point would you try to offer some protection? Could have been something as simple as, hey, you're choking them, let them go. That's the most disturbing thing to me about watching that video. It's even more disturbing than the person who committed the act, is to actually see people just not doing anything, not trying to protect him. And I want to just end with something, because it's easy for me to tell you to put yourself in a hypothetical situation, but they say you never know what you're going to do until you're in the situation. So I was in a situation one time where I saw someone being choked to death. I was on a bus, and we see all of these stories about, somebody attacking MTA worker because of whatever reason. The person was upset that the driver wouldn't open the door, because they're not supposed to open the bus unless they're at the designated stop. The person blocked the bus, and eventually the driver, went against the rule and opened the door just so that the bus could get going. I guess that wasn't good enough for the person, because when they got on the bus, they sucker punched the driver, and then the driver, defended themselves. But somewhere along the lines, this person got the driver in the chokehold, to the point that he actually pulled the driver, out of their little seat area. And here it was, I'm all the way in the last row of the bus. There's several people before me. None of these people did anything. Nobody said anything. We're all just sitting here watching this driver being choked to death. And although I felt fair, at a certain point, I said, I have to do something to protect this driver. And I went up there, and the only thing I could do was, I had my cane. I hit the guy with my cane, just to get him off of the driver. And he did let go of the driver. And the weirdest thing is, when he let go of the driver, he turned around and looked at me. And I felt like I was looking at a grizzly bear. And I don't know what happened, but he just looked at me and said, have a nice day. And he got off the bus. And I'll just tell you what I later found out. This person has a metal plate in their head. I think when I hit them, I hit that metal plate, and it actually, like, just because it was a person who was a war veteran. And I think when they were choking this driver, it was someplace else. But I just say that to say I do know that protection is important when someone is very vulnerable. And there's nothing more vulnerable than homeless people or people experiencing homelessness. Thank you. Sorry I went off script, but just something that was in my heart to share.
Thank you, Dennis. Now we're gonna have Will. I'm gonna bring down the presentation. Let me get off of here, and then Will, feel free to get started.
Thank you, Natalie, and thanks, Dennis. As you're going to start to hear, this is something that we feel very strongly about, and it's going to come across in a lot about what we have to share. So I'd like to establish what the first ask would be for those of you that would like to assist us in this process going forward. And that's just basically want to include us in your legislative priorities for 2025. What does that look like when you're meeting with legislators? If you could include support for the Homeless Protection Act rather in your asks, that would be appreciated. If you could take a moment and review who signed on in support last year and ask them to recommit, especially if you have to reintroduce the legislation, or also ask them to sign on for the first time. And if you are doing leave behinds in for your own section, if you could also keep our one pager in your folder so that it's also there for the folks to review, that would be really important. The other thing that can be done as part of this ask would be to submit organizational memos of support. Bill sponsors last year let us know that these memos make a really big difference in showing that there's a broad support for the legislation rather to central staff, and it helps us get the bills on the agenda for the committee so they can be voted on. We will be able to provide templates for memo support if folks need it, so definitely reach out. And in addition, if it could include examples of how this legislation would impact the people you serve, that would be really impactful. I know that it's in the work that I do in advocacy, I either know someone who has directly experienced some kind of violence because of their homeless status, or they know the story of someone who has experienced a violence. In fact, I'm going to step aside and let you hear what are those stories, and turn it over to my friend Philip.
Thanks, Will. I appreciate that. I'm Philip Malbranch. I am on the Consumer Advisory Board of Care for the Homeless, meaning that I'm one of the client leaders. I also am on the board of directors at Care for the Homeless. And this is important to me because I have the experience of violence for appearing to be poor or homeless. One day, probably in 2006, in the year 2006, I was reading a book on a park bench a Saturday morning near the drop-in center where I was staying at the time in Brooklyn. After a few minutes, a group of boys came to me and surrounded me and falsely accused me of hurting a girl who was with them, a young girl. They questioned me, and one guy stood behind me, apparently with the sole purpose of striking me. And he hit me in the same place once, and then a second time. And there was a series of strikes in the same place at the nape of my neck while I was being questioned by the others. I was at first seated, but eventually we all ended up in an open area in the park. And I was being struck and questioned at the same time. I started to see stars, and just before I figured I would pass out, a passerby came by, probably having seen this group in the middle of the park, to ask what was going on. And I took the opportunity to leave. I gathered my shoes because I did not have them on at the time. And I had my glasses in hand because they had been, I had lost them after the first hit. And I had to make an appeal to get my glasses back. And because I was polite, I got my glasses back. But I had this experience of a beating by a pack of boys. And according to one national report, it is common that young boys are involved in attacks against people experiencing homelessness. Possibly gang related, I'm not sure. But this was my experience, and I was able to get away because of this intervention of a stranger. I didn't stay to file a report, I just wanted to leave in one piece. And that was how I survived. I later learned at Care for the Homeless that there was such a thing as the Homeless Protection Act, and elected officials were not acting on it. Our action is not the first. It was I, because of this experience, who encouraged Care for the Homeless to be involved in trying to get this legislation passed. Because we know that there are people who, compared to others in society, do not value life. And some people think or believe in survival of the fittest. A person reading a book on the bench in a park is vulnerable, especially if he or she looks poor and incapable of defending him or herself. I was in that situation. I have had the experience of homelessness only because of a series of unlawful evictions, nothing that I have done, but because of what has been done to me. So there's an element of injustice in the homelessness crisis. The Homeless Protection Act is defense against this injustice, defense against the belief that some people have in society that human life is not valuable. That is basically my story and how I got involved in it. And I encourage you, those of you who may be interested in joining us, to join us. We are scheduling meetings with the legislators to educate them on this matter, because there is violence against people experiencing homelessness here, and we need help in getting support at the state level to pass this legislation, which has been ignored for too many years. The more people that we have who are willing to participate, the greater effect we can have in the meetings with the legislators as we instruct them, educate them. And the more folks we have will also add to the insight that we can present to elected officials. We would appreciate your participation. Also, if we do schedule a lobby day in person in Albany, it'd be great to have you participate in that. And you'll hear more information in a few minutes about how you can do that. Thanks for your attention to this very serious matter, because it deals with health issues, deals with human life, and because of negative information that is disseminated, we need to act on it in this way. One of the things about homelessness is that it eats away at personal relationships, at community, at social circles. And the misinformation that is disseminated, myths, stereotypes, have a tendency to devalue the person who is suffering, the person who is the subject of deviant behavior of others in our society, in our city, and in our state. So please be involved, and thank you for your attention. Next, I think, is Christina, who will be sharing with you.
Thank you for sharing your story, Philip. Hi, everyone. My name's Christina Abatista, and I'm the policy analyst at Urban Pathways. I'm going to start by talking about why the Homeless Protection Act is important to me. As policy staff at organizations that provide on-the-ground services, it's our responsibility and our pleasure, of course, to center the voices of our advocates with lived experience in this work. And as Philip had just mentioned, the Homeless Protection Act was brought to us by Philip specifically. And we went into exploring how we can get more involved. And the rest is history, as you have heard from Natalie and Nicole. Now, to get into our next calls to action, first of all, to show your support for the campaign, we ask that you sign up as a supporter, and you can do so as an organization sign-on as well as an individual supporter through the form on our website, which we will share in the chat. And it's important to sign on to show support for the Homeless Protection Act, as well as because once you do sign on, you will receive updates from us about our campaign actions and about the status of the bill, which, as you heard from Nicole, we are looking into some enhancements this session. Now, if you need to change the point person for your organization at any time, please feel free to email us and we will make sure that the right person at your organization is receiving our calls to action. And once you sign on, please share this information with the people you serve, your staff, and your networks to help us spread the word and to increase support. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will now pass the mic to Cynthia English.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Christina, and thank everybody for being here today. So I want to share with you all an incident that happened to me when I was street homeless. By the way, I'm a member of the board of CFH and also the Consumer Advisory Board. So this HPA, because of my personal experience, really touched a chord with me and made me want to get involved. So it's vitally important. But I was street homeless for a number of years, and I lived in encampments and derelict vehicles and places like that. And one early morning, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, I decided to go to the store to get a soda. And the encampment that I lived in was 2 blocks away from the corner store and also 2 blocks away from the local precinct. And that was one of the reasons that my group chose that particular site on 164th and Washington Avenue in the Bronx, because it was right next to the precinct and we thought somehow we would be a little safer. So I go to the store and I'm standing in line, and there are about 5 or 6 people around me. Now, during this period of time, I had the habit of wearing 2 or 3 coats and a couple of layers of pants, because I found out through the criminalization of homelessness that when you get arrested and you go to Rikers Island, you need a change of clothes, because if you're not city sentenced, you wear your own civilian clothes until you go to court. So it's good to have a change of clothes with you. So I'm standing in line and looking very different than the people around me. And we were approached by 2 young men. And I had my back to them. There was no conversation, no conflict of any kind. And all of a sudden, I felt a punch at the back of my head. And the next thing I knew, I was being beaten down to the ground by these 2 men. Everybody around me just stood there and watched. And I was on my back on the ground, and I happened to see past the particular assailant at the time and saw a friend of mine crossing the street. And so I screamed out to him to call the police, call the police. And he did that. And in a few minutes, a squad car came. No, let me backtrack. I'm sorry. After a few minutes, the guys gave up, I guess, because the way I was fighting them. And so they walked across the street, just very casually, like nothing had happened. And so then the squad car came, and I went to the car. I explained to the police what had happened. They asked me, did I know the guys or did I know where they were? And I told them, no, I don't know them. And they're right across the street. They were just standing there like, you know, nothing had happened. So the patrol car drove around to them and I followed and I identified them and they were arrested. And then my friend and I walked to the precinct and I filed an official police report. And one of the questions on the police report is, what is your address? So I put 164th and Washington Avenue. And so then I went back to my camp and I waited for about 2 weeks to hear from the police again or the district attorney's office, something. I heard nothing, so I went back to the precinct and I asked the same sergeant who had been there when I gave my report what was going on. He looked it up in the system and he found that one of the kids was released that night and the other one was remanded because he had an open warrant for something unrelated to my case. So nothing was done. I never heard anything back. I never got to face them in court as someone else might have who perhaps had a proper address. So this is really important to me. This bill is really important to me because as of right now, what happened to me actually never happened in the eyes of the law. And so what does that say to me in terms of the value of my life and who I am? There were several other incidences over the course of the next several years, some that landed me in the hospital, but I never went back to the police again. What was the point? What happened to this homeless lady did not matter. So this data is so vitally important because we do know that these types of incidences are woefully unreported. Natalie had said earlier that there's something like 75 documented cases from the last 25 years. Well, my case is not there. The cases of the many people that I knew over the years that I was homeless, those cases are not reported. Only the most egregious things like setting someone on fire is reported. People who have experienced violence because of their perceived housing status, it would really be impactful to educate folks on the reality of the situation. We need a diverse set of voices. So we'd really appreciate testimonials from those of you, any of you who have suffered violence because of your perceived housing status, or if you know of someone, a story of someone who has been a target of violence because of their housing status, or if you're a provider and through the course of your work, you've come in contact with consumers or clients who've experienced violence. We would really, really, really appreciate these testimonials. So I hope you all will get on board and support this very important bill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I just wanted to summarize the calls to action in one slide. And in just a few minutes, there'll be a poll going up. If you were at all interested in participating in any of the calls to action, just check as many as you're interested in, and we will reach out to you separately. So you're not necessarily committing, but if this is of interest to you, please just check them. But you see them listing here. So including HPA in your legislative priorities, submitting organization moments of support, joining meetings with legislators, signing up as a supporter, sharing the campaign, and submitting testimonials. So I just want to thank all of our advocates for telling the story and talking about the importance of this legislation, and to all of you. And I think I'll turn it over to Harmony for Q&A.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your stories and describing the power and the impact that the HPA could offer to so many people, and the need for data to describe the gravity of the need for this campaign. And I invite people to turn on your cameras and to go off of mute and to ask the group if you have any questions. Feel free to also do that in the chat box. But while we wait for some questions, I have a few myself. One, I'm not sure if you shared this in the chat box, but you include a slide on the representatives who supported this bill. Is there a way we could identify whether or not our local representatives support the bill online, or would you be able to share the slide again so people could look up the representatives based on their address?
Yeah, absolutely. I think after, we'll have the slides available for folks so that you can see those. And we should probably, since it's changed with the new legislation, probably won't the website, but for now, it would be good to share it with folks on the call to see if they can look to see if the representatives are supporting it. And if they're not, to reach out to them to ask them to support it, certainly.
Great. And I know the Advocacy Day. Oh, Cynthia, would you like to chime in?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was listening so intently. No, I wasn't trying to say anything.
No worries.
Did I miss something, y'all?
No,
No.
you're
Okay,
good.
okay.
And thank you, Jose, for adding information on how you can contact our elected officials. Does anyone else have any questions?
Hi, Anna. Yeah, so the template, I think what we can do is we will have it on our website. We're working on adding that as one of the buttons for folks. And then we can also send it in the follow-up email. That's okay, Harmony, is to include the template in that email for folks.
That would be
perfect. Yeah, so we can do that right now because that's a way for you to get access to that template specifically, and then we'll give you information on who to send it back to. So it'll be sent directly back to us so that we can share it with our sponsors as sort of a group, or the current group that we have right now. And then Nicole also shared in the chat the link to the legislation for both co-sponsors.
Thank you. I put an event feedback survey in the chat box, and I'm also going to launch a poll where you could select which calls to action you may be interested in participating in. We can also, send these offers and resources for calls to action in our follow-up email, along with the survey, or along with the recording and slides. I'm going to quickly plug in a few events led by the consortium. We have our big 14th annual convening on October 23rd, and it's our once a year opportunity for a day-long discussion on critical issues at the intersection of health and housing. And we have really exciting panels on the Medicaid 1115 waiver and the role of social care networks, we have a panel on innovations, on approaches to tackling health and housing issues, and then also safe practices on hospital discharge from hospitals into respite, supportive housing, and other forms of housing. I put the link for that event in the chat box. And then we also have a few events, a 2-part series on Section 8 housing choice vouchers, and then a 2-session series on Medicare and open enrollment. So you could find all of our events too in the chat box. And I know we have a lot of links in the chat box, so we'll be sure to send that too. Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to take yourself off mute.
There was a question in the chat, a template for letters. I don't know if you got to that.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we'll send that. And then I suppose it's not scheduled yet, but do you anticipate a month when you plan to do the Albany Day?
We have not scheduled that yet. I think we have to look at sort of the strategy for the upcoming session and seeing when we're able to do something in person. But if you sign up as a supporter, you will get updates on all that information once we have it available.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
And then we have a minute left. If no one else has any questions, do any of the speakers here have final remarks, final notes to share with the group?
Harmony, is it possible to publish the poll just to see if there was any participation?
Yes, we will send it over to you. Yes, we have it.
Oh, I mean, like on the screen to see if
Here,
people.
let's see. Yes. Let's see if we could share it. Cynthia, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in closing that this bill is really important, and those testimonials are something that we really need because of the fact that these incidences are so underreported. Being able to compile some true life testimonials, documentation of how much more pervasive this issue is than we think it is would be really, really helpful. So I hope you will all participate because, you know, I'm your mother, I'm your sister, I'm your auntie, I'm your grandmother, and I don't think I hold any less value than anybody else's mother, auntie, sister, or grandmother. So I really just hope you will all participate, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, Harmony, we just want to thank Consortium for inviting us to do this, and then also for everybody that attended for us. And obviously a huge thanks to our advocates who are, you know, providing sort of the real life experiences for this and doing a lot of work to try to get this passed. So a lot of thanks to them for participating in this as well.
Thank you so much for participating as speakers, and thank you so much to everybody who tuned in as attendees. Again, we'll send over all the resources described throughout the presentation and in the chat box, as well as the recording after the session. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat box. Otherwise, I hope each of you have a wonderful day, and I hope each of you take good care.
Yes. Everyone take care and have a wonderful weekend.
Have a good evening, everyone.